first light reached the Central Pacific on the 4th of June 1942, with a muted glow that revealed little of the tension concealed across hundreds of miles of open water. The weather remained calm, with scattered cloud layers drifting above the sea and a steady wind moving across the swells. Visibility fluctuated along the horizon, yet the conditions remained favorable for carrier aviation. Beneath this otherwise ordinary surface rested a convergence of fleets, intelligence assessments, and strategic calculations that would shape the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese carrier striking force positioned northwest of Midway. Atoll advanced in disciplined formation. Its decks carried aircraft armed for the initial phase of a complex operation. Behind their outward precision lay fatigue from weeks at sea, logistical limits imposed by distance and assumptions formed through years of dominance at sea. The four carriers of the First Air Fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, held their assigned positions, each surrounded by escorts arranged to counter submarine and surface threats. Crews worked through the night to prepare aircraft for the opening strike against Midway. The operational schedule required a rapid sequence, a dawn launch to neutralize the island's airfields, a swift recovery of the strike group, and a follow-on action to destroy any American naval response. The plan's success depended on timing coordination and the belief that the U.S. carriers remained too distant to intervene. In the command spaces aboard Akagi, senior officers reviewed final reports from reconnaissance aircraft, already en route to their early morning patrol sectors. The mood remained confident, yet measured. Experience had shown that the American Navy could offer resistance, but its carrier strength was believed insufficient to alter the strategic balance of the operation. Midway Atoll, lying to the southeast, operated under a different form of tension. Ground crews and patrol aircraft had been on heightened alert for days due to repeated intelligence warnings. American officers knew the Japanese Navy intended to strike the atoll, but the exact moment depended on weather timing and Japanese operational discipline. Throughout the night, radar operators scanned for signs of approaching aircraft. The island's air strength, composed of Marines, Navy pilots, and Army Air Forces bombers, waited to respond to the approaching assault. Their aircraft were dispersed to reduce vulnerability to the first wave. On the ground, mechanics and ordnance teams worked methodically to ensure that fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft remained ready for immediate deployment. Every participant understood that Midway represented a forward outpost whose survival had broader operational value. Far to the east beyond the horizon and beyond Japanese observation, the American carrier task forces maneuvered into position. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown maintained radio silence and operated under strict operational discipline. Their commanders held an advantage that remained unknown to Japanese planners. They possessed accurate information regarding the direction, timing, and purpose of the approaching fleet. This knowledge, derived from code breaking and confirmed through reconnaissance, allowed them to position their carriers to the northeast of Midway, ready to launch aircraft as soon as the Japanese fleet revealed itself. The American carriers moved cautiously, aware that their survival depended on avoiding detection. Aircraft on their decks were arranged for rapid launch, with armorers and handlers preparing them for a decisive engagement. The early morning hours brought the first signals of impending action. Before sunrise, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft searched their assigned expanses. The patrol pattern extended across wide arcs, yet gaps remained due to crew availability, aircraft range, and the inherent challenge of covering such a vast operational area. These gaps would later prove significant. The Japanese command team operated under the assumption that American carriers were unlikely to interfere during the opening phase. Their operational posture reflected this belief. Aircraft prepared for the strike against Midway carried bombs suited for land targets, not naval engagements. Deck crews had been instructed to keep reserve aircraft in readiness, but rearming procedures required time and exposed the carriers to risk if an unexpected threat appeared. As dawn progressed, the Japanese strike group approached Midway. Pilots observed the atoll's limited terrain, emerging from the ocean, flanked by coral reefs and small islands. Their mission aimed to neutralize defensive installations, destroy aircraft on the ground, and weaken the island sufficiently to permit an eventual amphibious landing. Communications between aircraft and flagship reported initial contact. Radar operators on Midway detected the incoming formation and issued warnings across the island. Air raid sirens activated, prompting personnel to move to prepared positions. Within minutes, American fighters began ascending to intercept the approaching Japanese aircraft. Their climb occurred under time pressure hampered by the altitude advantage held by the incoming force. Nonetheless, the defenders prepared to engage with the understanding that preserving the island required resisting the first strike as effectively as possible. While Midway readied its response, American carrier commanders received updates through their own reconnaissance systems. Reports indicated the Japanese strike force's launch and confirmed the location of the enemy fleet relative to the atoll. The American carriers maintained their heading to position themselves within effective launch range. The knowledge that the Japanese carriers had initiated their first strike created a narrow opportunity. During the recovery of returning aircraft, the Japanese carriers would be vulnerable, their decks congested, and their crews occupied with refueling and rearming operations. This window depended on the precise timing of the returning strike group and the readiness of the Japanese fleet to shift its armament for a second phase of operations. Accurate timing would determine whether the Americans could exploit this vulnerability. The early hours of 4th of June thus formed a quiet but decisive backdrop. Japanese pilots focused on their immediate tasks, unaware of the impending risk to their carriers. American pilots on deck waited for the signal to launch their aircraft, prepared for long-range strikes requiring navigation through cloud layers and over hundreds of miles of ocean. On Midway, anti-aircraft crews moved into assigned positions. Across this wide expanse of sea and sky, pressures accumulated operational assumptions, the limitations of reconnaissance, the demands of timing, and the reliance on coordinated movement. The fleets remained separated by distance, yet connected by the converging paths of their aircraft. Every participant confronted an environment shaped by constraints. The Japanese fleet operated at the limit of its logistical support, depending on mobile tenders, escorts, and forward bases. Fuel stores determined operational endurance, dictating how long the carriers could remain engaged before requiring withdrawal. American forces faced similar restrictions, but compensated with intelligence advantages and a shorter supply line to Pearl Harbor. Both sides relied on the skill of their aviators, many of whom had little combat experience in multi-carrier engagements. The Japanese pilots carried the confidence formed during years of successful operations. The Americans carried the urgency of defending territory and preventing further expansion of Japanese control. By the time the sun rose fully above the horizon, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully understood. The Japanese fleet believed it approached a weakened opponent and viewed Midway as an opportunity to consolidate earlier victories. The American fleet recognized the gravity of the moment and the possibility that the battle could determine the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. Beneath the calm morning light, each fleet prepared to implement plans structured around assumptions that would soon collide with reality. The decisive minutes that later defined the battle had not yet arrived, but the conditions that would make them possible were already in motion. Aircraft were airborne, flight decks were occupied, reconnaissance gaps remained, and operational decisions waited to be made under pressure. The Pacific appeared calm, yet the balance of naval power rested on actions unfolding in these early hours. The fleets operated with discipline and planning, yet the outcome would depend on timing, chance, and the ability to adapt under rapidly changing conditions. As dawn spread across the ocean, the forces that would shape the next phase of the war approached their critical intersection. The operation that culminated in the events of 4th of June 1942 emerged from a sequence of strategic assessments conducted within the Imperial Japanese Navy during the months following its rapid expansion across the Pacific. The victory at Pearl Harbor had delivered a significant psychological and operational advantage, yet it did not eliminate the American carrier force, nor did it secure long-term Japanese dominance. Senior naval planners recognized that the United States possessed industrial resources capable of restoring its fleet if given sufficient time. Japanese strategy, therefore, sought a decisive engagement that would eliminate remaining American carriers before those resources could be fully mobilized. This objective guided the development of the Midway operation. It originated from the belief that an offensive push toward the Central Pacific would force the American Navy to respond, allowing Japan to conduct the kind of carrier battle for which its forces were trained. The initial concept took shape within the 1st Air Fleet staff, where operational planners sought a target that balanced strategic value with vulnerability. Midway Atoll occupied a position that fit these requirements. It served as a forward American outpost, enabling reconnaissance across the Central Pacific and offering a potential staging area for future operations. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and constrain American mobility. Additionally, the atoll's location made it predictable that American carriers would attempt to defend it. The Japanese High Command interpreted these factors as creating favorable conditions for drawing the American fleet into a decisive clash under circumstances controlled by Japan. These strategic considerations interacted with internal debates among Japanese naval leaders. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, favored aggressive action to maintain momentum after early victories. He believed that seizing the initiative remained essential to preventing the United States from reorganizing its forces for a counteroffensive. Other officers expressed caution, pointing to the extended supply lines required for operations so far from Japan's main bases. They noted the risks inherent in coordinating multiple task forces across vast distances while maintaining secrecy. These concerns shaped the planning process, but did not halt Yamamoto's determination to execute an operation that met Japan's strategic goals. The earliest documentation of the Midway concept appears in staff papers drafted shortly after the Battle of the Coral Sea. That engagement, fought in early May 1942, revealed weaknesses within Japanese planning. Although Japanese forces inflicted significant damage, the loss of the carrier Shokaku to bomb damage and the severe depletion of air crews aboard Zuikaku reduced the number of fleet carriers available for future operations. This limited Japan's ability to project force while simultaneously supporting operations in multiple theaters. Nonetheless, Yamamoto interpreted the Coral Sea battle as an opportunity rather than a setback. He believed that the Americans had been weakened sufficiently to justify an offensive that would force their carriers into a vulnerable position. Planners thus pressed forward with preparations for a coordinated strike on Midway, reinforced by a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands intended to confuse American observers. As the concept matured, operational assumptions formed around intelligence assessments that suggested American naval forces remained at reduced strength. Japanese reconnaissance estimated that only 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, had survived the Pacific engagements to date. Furthermore, the assumption prevailed that Yorktown damage during the Coral Sea battle required extensive repairs and would be unavailable for immediate service. These assessments significantly influenced Japanese confidence in the operation. Their intelligence officers believed the American response would be limited and predictable, allowing the Japanese carriers to dictate the terms of the engagement. The idea of catching the American fleet by surprise remained central, despite the inherent risks of operating near the limits of Japanese logistical endurance. The plan formally presented to the combined fleet incorporated several stages. The initial phase required destroying Midway's defenses through a carrier-based air assault. Following this, land-based aircraft and amphibious forces would secure the atoll. Meanwhile, the main carrier striking force would engage and annihilate any American naval units that attempted to intervene. Additional forces would patrol the surrounding waters to detect submarines or surface vessels that might threaten the operation. The strategy relied on the assumption that Japanese forces could maintain the initiative through coordinated timing and the rapid execution of each phase. Supporting forces, including battleships and cruisers, were assigned roles that reflected traditional naval doctrine but played a secondary part compared to the carrier fleet. Throughout the planning process, tensions persisted regarding the balance between ambition and practicality. Some officers within the Japanese Navy questioned whether the operation required more resources than available, or whether it risked exposing the fleet to significant danger in unfamiliar waters. These concerns appeared in internal memoranda, but did not alter the overarching direction. The belief that a decisive battle remained essential to Japan's long-term strategy overshadowed operational hesitations. Yamamoto's influence ensured that the plan advanced, despite differing opinions. American intelligence efforts, however, began to erode the secrecy on which Japanese planners depended. Code-breaking units working in Hawaii and Washington intercepted communications from the Japanese Navy and identified Midway as the target of the planned offensive. These discoveries allowed American commanders to prepare their forces with knowledge unavailable to their opponents. The decision to defend Midway with carrier forces emerged directly from this intelligence advantage. Yet, the Japanese command remained unaware of the extent to which its plans had been compromised. The divergence between Japanese assumptions and American preparations became a defining feature of the conflict's origins. In the weeks leading up to 4th of June, Japanese forces assembled across several staging areas. Carriers refueled aircraft, underwent maintenance, and crews prepared for a complex sequence of battles. Supply convoys and support ships moved toward predetermined rendezvous points. The coordination required for such an operation revealed the scale of Japan's commitment. Once underway, the fleet advanced through areas monitored by American submarines, though initial contacts did not disrupt the Japanese timetable. By late May, the carrier strike force reached its position northwest of Midway, maintaining radio silence in efforts to avoid detection. The origins of the Midway Gambit thus reflected a combination of strategic ambition, operational confidence, and the assumption that the United States remained unprepared for a coordinated naval response. These factors shaped the context in which the carriers approached Midway at dawn on the 4th June. The plan's roots lay in earlier successes and in the belief that Japan could determine the course of the war through decisive action. The convergence of these ideas set the stage for the confrontation that followed, forming a backdrop against which the events of that morning would unfold with unexpected consequences. The appearance of vulnerability in the Japanese carrier force on the morning of 4th June 1942 emerged as a direct contrast to the strategic expectations that had guided Japan's naval campaigns in the months prior. For years, imperial planners had constructed their doctrine around the notion of delivering a decisive blow early in a conflict using massed carrier aviation to disable enemy fleets before they could achieve operational coherence. This approach had proven effective in the opening months of the Pacific War, as Japanese forces secured victories across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. The belief in continued offensive momentum shaped their confidence. Yet at Midway, a rapid reversal occurred that neither planners nor commanders anticipated. The destruction of 3 fleet carriers within a span of minutes overturned expectations that had guided operational thinking and reshaped the strategic landscape. This reversal emerged not from a single unexpected event, but from the cumulative effect of earlier assumptions. Japanese naval doctrine rested on the principle that superior training discipline and aircraft performance would overcome any weaknesses arising from distance or logistical constraints. Japanese carrier air groups had demonstrated significant skill throughout operations from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Their record reinforced a belief that American pilots lacked equivalent proficiency. Further, Japanese leaders interpreted prior engagements as confirming that American naval command struggled to coordinate multi-carrier operations under combat pressure. These assessments informed decisions made during the planning of the Midway operation, shaping a confidence that the upcoming battle would follow familiar patterns. However, the American approach to the conflict had already begun to diverge from Japanese expectations. The integration of intelligence assessments into fleet positioning gave the American carriers an advantage that Japanese planners had not accounted for. Although Japan employed reconnaissance aircraft to monitor potential threats, its coverage remained incomplete. Moreover, Japanese commanders believed that their operational timeline would prevent an American carrier force from intervening during the critical early hours of the attack. These assumptions made the Japanese carriers vulnerable at the moment they prepared to recover their Midway strike group, a period known to be operationally hazardous due to the need for refueling and rearming. The speed and accuracy of the American counterstrike would exploit this vulnerability, resulting in a sudden shift in the battle's direction. The shock created by the destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu stemmed from the contrast between Japanese expectations and the reality of the engagement. Prior to the attack, senior officers aboard the 1st Air Fleet maintained confidence that they had drawn the American carriers into a predictable situation. When reports arrived that American aircraft had been sighted, the assumption prevailed that they originated from Midway rather than from mobile carrier groups. These misinterpretations delayed necessary changes in operational posture. By the time Japanese commanders realized that American carrier aircraft had entered the battle with coordinated attacks, the situation had already begun to exceed their defensive capacity. The strategic reversal also reflected the nature of carrier warfare. Aircraft carriers depend on the coordination of air groups' deck operations and escort support. At the moment of the dive bomber attacks, Japanese carriers held ordnance on their decks and within their hangars as part of ongoing rearming procedures. This created a hazardous environment that exponentially increased the damage caused by incoming bombs. The resulting fires spread rapidly, overwhelming damage control crews. Japanese carriers designed for offensive operations and built with lighter protection to maximize range and speed lacked the defensive resilience necessary to contain such internal explosions. These vulnerabilities hastened the collapse of the fleet's ability to continue the battle. American observers later noted the narrow window during which the attack occurred. Minutes of timing determined whether the Japanese carriers would have been able to launch their own counterstrike or defend themselves more effectively. The convergence of American dive bomber squadrons over the Japanese fleet at the same moment when Japanese fighters remained out of position created an opportunity that rarely emerged in carrier warfare. This precise moment, shaped by reconnaissance reports, fuel constraints, navigation errors, and the challenges of coordinating long-range formations, produced the environment in which the reversal took place. Japanese officers experienced this shift with a combination of disbelief and urgency. The rapid loss of multiple carriers within a short period contradicted expectations formed through years of naval operations. Prior engagements had rarely exposed the First Air Fleet to concentrated attacks at such close range. The visibility of the fires and explosions aboard the carriers created an immediate awareness among the fleet that the operational center of the Japanese Navy had been compromised. Communications became strained as commanders attempted to reorganize surviving forces. Escort vessels attempted rescue operations, while also preparing for further attacks. The sudden collapse of 3 major carriers removed essential components of Japan's offensive capability, altering the balance of the battle before a coherent response could be implemented. The event shocked strategic planners in Tokyo as well. Reports filtered back through coded communications that lacked the detail necessary to convey the full extent of the losses. Initial messages suggested damage, but did not indicate the scale of destruction. Only later assessments revealed that Japan had lost irreplaceable air crews alongside the carriers themselves. The loss of experienced pilots and deck personnel represented a deeper strategic setback than the loss of the ships alone. Japanese naval aviation had invested heavily in pilot training during the pre-war years, but its system lacked the capacity to rapidly replace seasoned aviators. This deficiency would influence the broader trajectory of the war. For the United States, the sudden reversal marked a rare moment in which tactical success aligned directly with strategic necessity. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers eliminated a significant portion of the offensive power that had driven Japan's early victories. Whereas American carriers could be repaired or replaced through industrial production, the Japanese fleet did not possess equivalent resources. Thus, the outcome at Midway reversed not only the immediate tactical situation, but also the direction of the naval war. American leaders recognized that the momentum of Japanese expansion had been interrupted, and that the opportunity existed to shift toward a long-term strategy of attrition and counteroffensive operations. The shock associated with this reversal extended beyond military strategy. Observers recognized that the loss of these carriers had implications for diplomacy, regional control, and the perception of Japanese invincibility. Nations monitoring the conflict understood that Japan's capacity to sustain large-scale naval operations had diminished. Similarly, American morale improved significantly, following the victory reinforcing domestic support for a prolonged campaign. The rapid change in the balance of naval power formed a foundation for future operations across the Pacific, including the campaigns in the Solomon Islands and the Central Pacific. The unexpected speed of Japan's losses at Midway thus defined the moment as a strategic inflection point. A plan rooted in earlier assumptions collapsed within minutes, revealing the fragility of doctrines that depended on controlled timing and uninterrupted coordination. The sudden reversal demonstrated that the outcome of a naval battle could shift dramatically when opposing forces exploited narrow windows of opportunity. This realization reshaped the conduct of carrier warfare for the remainder of the conflict and left a lasting imprint on the strategic landscape of the Pacific War. The foundations of the Midway engagement rested on a broad network of intelligence efforts, reconnaissance patrols, staff assessments, and operational briefings conducted by both Japanese and American commands in the weeks preceding the battle. The confrontation on the 4th June 1942 emerged from work that took place far from the carriers themselves, from cipher rooms, code-breaking units forward, airfields, naval command centers, and the decks of long-range patrol aircraft traversing thousands of miles of open ocean. The details gathered in these spaces shaped the decisions that placed the opposing carrier groups on intersecting courses. Although the battle is often remembered for its brief, decisive moments, its origins lay in methodical processes that accumulated over time, forming the basis for the operational choices made on the morning of the engagement. American codebreakers played a central role in identifying Midway as the Japanese target. Analysts working at Station Hypo in Hawaii spent months reconstructing partial messages from the Japanese Navy's encrypted communications system. Their progress involved assembling fragments of intercepts mapping patterns in Japanese message traffic and correlating intelligence with reconnaissance reports. By May 1942, they identified the designation AF in Japanese communications as a likely reference to Midway. Confirmation occurred when American officers instructed Midway's garrison to transmit an unencrypted message reporting a failure in its freshwater system. Soon after, Japanese intercepted communications referred to AF experiencing water shortages. This alignment of signals validated American assessments and provided commanders with reliable insight into enemy intentions. Within the planning rooms at Pearl Harbor, the intelligence findings were integrated into operational preparations. Charts displayed the expected Japanese approach routes, while staff officers calculated the probable timing of the enemy fleet's movements, based on earlier patterns of Japanese operations. The American command recognized that Japan intended to strike Midway with a large force, and that the attack would likely include efforts to lure American carriers into a position where they could be destroyed. Yet American planners also knew that surprise had shifted to their advantage. They formulated plans that placed their carriers northeast of Midway, allowing them to approach the Japanese fleet unobserved. This position leveraged intelligence insights while avoiding the reconnaissance patterns Japan used to monitor potential threats. Japanese intelligence efforts, although extensive, failed to detect the full extent of American preparations. Their reconnaissance units monitored American bases in Hawaii and along the West Coast, yet they underestimated American capacity to repair damaged ships. The belief that Yorktown would be unavailable influenced the Japanese command's confidence. In reality, American shipyard crews at Pearl Harbor restored the carrier to operational condition within an exceptionally short time frame, enabling her to join the task force destined for Midway. Japanese analysts did not detect this development due to radio silence enforced by the American fleet and the absence of updated reconnaissance over Pearl Harbor during the critical period. Reconnaissance played a major role in the battle's early stages. Long-range aircraft based on Midway conducted patrols across wide arcs. Their mission aimed to locate the Japanese fleet, provide timely warnings, and coordinate defensive responses. These patrols confronted significant challenges, including limited visibility, extended flight durations, and the need to conserve fuel. Despite these difficulties, early morning sightings on 4th of June confirmed the approach of the Japanese strike group. The patrol pilots transmitted critical information that reached the carriers and the island's defenders, enabling them to adjust their preparations. Japanese reconnaissance efforts, though disciplined, suffered from the constraints inherent in large-scale naval operations. Their patrol arcs left gaps that allowed the American carriers to avoid early detection. One Japanese scout plane launched later than scheduled due to mechanical issues resulting in a delayed surveillance sweep that failed to identify the American fleet until critical moments had passed. Additionally, the distance between Japanese units made coordinated reconnaissance more difficult. The Japanese had hoped that their operational plan would mask their movements, yet they underestimated the precision with which American intelligence analysts monitored their communications. The intelligence process extended beyond reconnaissance. Staff officers aboard both Japanese and American carriers maintained detailed records of aircraft, readiness, fuel consumption, and armament loads. These records guided decisions about when and how to launch aircraft. Japanese commanders evaluated reports from the Midway Strike Group as they returned to their carriers, determining whether the next phase of operations required rearming aircraft with torpedoes rather than bombs. These decisions unfolded within the planning rooms, located at the heart of each carrier, where officers relied on charts, communication logs, and technical assessments to guide their choices. In Tokyo, senior naval planners reviewed updates from the fleet and assessed them within the broader strategic context. They expected the Midway operation to proceed according to the doctrine that had guided earlier victories. The presence of multiple task groups, carrier forces, battleships, cruisers, and the Aleutian diversion reflected the scale of the combined operation. Staff officers tracked the movements of each element and evaluated their coordination. They depended on timely communication, yet the operation's complexity made seamless integration difficult. The distance between command centers and the front line introduced delays that limited Tokyo's ability to adjust to rapidly changing circumstances. American staff rooms experienced similar pressures. The officers responsible for coordinating long-range strikes received reconnaissance updates that required immediate interpretation. They evaluated wind direction, flight distances, fuel estimates, and the expected location of the Japanese carriers. Their work on the morning of 4th June aimed to synchronize the launch of multiple air groups from Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown. Although not all squadrons followed the intended flight paths, the decision to launch early reflected the American command's reliance on intelligence that revealed the Japanese fleet's vulnerability during its recovery window. The work of archivists, intelligence officers, and operations staff formed a foundation that enabled historians to reconstruct the planning environment. Surviving documents include decoded messages, handwritten notes from planning sessions, flight logs, and reports filed after the battle. These materials reveal the extent to which both sides relied on detailed information and systems to support their operations. They also show the limitations imposed by uncertainty. Reconnaissance could provide only partial clarity. Intercepted communications required interpretation. Staff assessments measured variables that change rapidly under combat conditions. The combination of intelligence and reconnaissance shaped the environment in which the decisive events of Midway took place. American analysts provided their commanders with a rare advantage. Japanese planners worked from assumptions that proved increasingly inaccurate as the battle progressed. The distance between expectation and reality reflected the broader relationship between intelligence efforts and operational outcomes. Each decision made within planning rooms or aboard patrol aircraft contributed to the sequence of events that ultimately led to the confrontation on 4th June. By the time the Japanese carriers approached Midway, the intelligence systems of both sides had completed the work that set the battle's conditions. The events that followed would unfold within the framework developed through these earlier efforts, demonstrating the influence of information, gathering interpretation, and the decisions shaped by them. The confrontation that later defined the battle's legacy depended not only on actions taken on flight decks, but also on the less visible processes that determined where each fleet positioned itself upon the wide Pacific. The escalation of tension within the Imperial Japanese Navy during the weeks leading to the Midway operation reflected the structural and operational pressures that accumulated across multiple fronts. The Japanese command structure had been built to support aggressive expansion, but by early 1942 it confronted the logistical strain of sustaining operations across vast distances. These pressures intensified as the combined fleet prepared for its move into the Central Pacific. Senior officers understood that they were committing the core of Japan's carrier strength to an operation that required precision, rapid coordination, and an outcome that justified the risks involved. The constraints shaping their decisions grew more rigid as the fleet advanced toward Midway, compressing the margin for error and narrowing the range of available responses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto operated under competing priorities. On one hand, he sought to maintain the initiative that had defined Japan's early successes. On the other, he confronted a strategic landscape in which Japan faced increasing material disadvantages. American industrial output had begun to accelerate, and Japanese analysts recognized that failure to neutralize American carrier strength early in the war would create long-term consequences. These assessments influenced Yamamoto's conviction that the Midway operation represented a necessary gamble. He viewed the battle not simply as another offensive action, but as a decisive effort to prevent a protracted conflict that Japan could not sustain. This belief shaped the urgency that permeated his orders. The pressure extended through the ranks of operational planners responsible for coordinating the multiple elements of the Midway campaign. The operation required the integration of carrier aviation, surface fleets, submarine patrols, amphibious units, and land-based aircraft. Each component followed a timetable that depended on synchronized movement. The Japanese Navy lacked sufficient experience with multi-axis operations on this scale, and its command structure had been shaped around centralized directives rather than distributed coordination. As a result, staff officers faced the difficult task of overseeing a sequence of movements that demanded flexibility while adhering to strict operational timing. Fuel consumption represented a persistent concern. The First Air Fleet operated far from Japan's primary supply bases, and refueling at sea remained a challenging process that required calm conditions and precise maneuvering. Tankers assigned to the fleet carried enough fuel to support the initial phases of the operation, but extended combat or unanticipated delays could strain reserves. Japanese planners recognized the risks involved, but believed that the quick elimination of the American carriers would reduce the fleet's exposure. Nonetheless, the logistical pressures influenced operational decisions, including the need to maintain high cruising speeds to preserve tactical options. These demands limited the fleet's ability to alter course rapidly or extend its search patterns. Another source of tension emerged from Japan's recent engagements. The Battle of the Coral Sea had exposed weaknesses in Japanese carrier operations that could not be rapidly addressed. The loss of experienced air crews aboard Shokaku and Zuikaku reduced the number of elite pilots available for Midway. The Japanese Navy's training system produced highly skilled aviators, but it required significant time to prepare replacements. Consequently, the air groups assigned to the Midway operation operated at reduced strength compared to earlier campaigns. Despite this, Japanese commanders believed that their remaining pilots retained enough experience to deliver a decisive blow. The need to compensate for the gaps in air crew availability added further pressure to execute the operation with minimal delay. Within the carrier task force, pressure accumulated as senior officers confronted the operational complexity of managing aircraft loadouts, reconnaissance schedules, and defensive postures. The decision to launch the first strike against Midway created an initial commitment that limited flexibility. Aircraft were loaded with bombs suited for land targets, requiring significant time to convert them for anti-ship missions. This process involved moving ordnance, adjusting fusing mechanisms, and coordinating with fuel crews preparing aircraft for their next sortie. Japanese deck operations were efficient, yet the procedures remained time-consuming. These constraints meant that once aircraft were prepared for one mission, any rapid change in conditions could force the carriers into a vulnerable situation. The pressure intensified when early reconnaissance reports lacked clarity. Japanese scout aircraft covered wide areas, but gaps in patrol patterns created uncertainty about the American fleet's location. When incomplete reports indicated the possible presence of American ships officers aboard Akagi, and the other carriers faced a dilemma. Refueling and rearming returning aircraft required immediate attention, yet shifting to an anti-ship posture demanded rapid adjustments. The time required to reconfigure aircraft created a window in which the carriers remained exposed. Senior officers debated whether the situation justified diverting aircraft from the recovery process, balancing the need for immediate defense against the operational requirements of managing the Midway strike group. The pressure on the Imperial Command also extended to the strategic assumptions underlying the operation. Japanese leaders expected that the Aleutian diversion would draw American attention away from Midway, allowing the main carrier force to maintain operational surprise. This assumption influenced the timing of the attack and the coordination of supporting units. However, American commanders did not divert their carriers to the Aleutians, instead concentrating their forces in the Central Pacific. The Japanese Navy lacked updated intelligence to detect this shift, leaving its command structure dependent on earlier assessments that had become inaccurate. This disconnect between expectation and reality contributed to a growing tension within the Japanese command that remained unresolved as the carriers approached their initial launch point. Weather conditions added further uncertainty. Cloud layers, shifting winds, and uneven visibility influenced reconnaissance effectiveness and complicated flight operations. Carrier aviation depended heavily on stable atmospheric conditions, especially during mass launches and recoveries. Although the weather on the morning of 4th of June appeared generally favorable, earlier atmospheric instability had limited the accuracy of some reconnaissance efforts. Japanese officers had built their operational calendar around weather patterns, but the inherent unpredictability of the Central Pacific introduced another factor that they could not fully control. Communications played a critical role in shaping the pressure that officers felt as the battle approached. Radio silence, essential for maintaining surprise, restricted the ability of the carriers to adapt quickly. Once the operation began, communication between task groups occurred through secure channels, yet the structure of the operation dispersed units across broad distances. Coordination with battleships, cruisers, submarines, and support vessels required careful timing that left little room for improvisation. The isolation of the carrier force during crucial moments reflected the limitations imposed by the operation's design. As the day progressed, these accumulated pressures became increasingly visible. Officers faced the immediate demands of managing flight operations, while also anticipating a possible American naval response. The need to rearm aircraft, maintain defensive readiness, and interpret incomplete reconnaissance reports created a complex environment in which critical decisions had to be made rapidly. The narrow space between operational requirements and emerging threats limited the Japanese fleet's capacity to respond effectively when American dive bombers approached. The pressures that had shaped the Imperial Command did not arise suddenly on the 4th of June. They reflected the cumulative strain of months of rapid expansion, extensive operations, and strategic calculations that left little margin for error. These constraints influenced the decisions that placed the Japanese carriers in a vulnerable posture during the critical minutes of the battle. As events unfolded, the operational tensions that had accumulated throughout the planning and execution of the Midway operation contributed directly to the outcome that followed. The convergence of the American and Japanese carrier forces on the 4th of June 1942 reflected the movement of two fleets shaped by distinct doctrines, operational priorities, and command philosophies. Each side approached the engagement with resources positioned according to its strategic assessments, yet the differences in their formations, aircraft readiness, and internal decision-making would play a decisive role in the hours that followed. The Pacific Ocean between Midway and the Japanese carriers served as the operational corridor through which aircraft reconnaissance units and command decisions moved, creating an environment in which timing carried the weight of strategy. The Japanese carrier striking force known as the First Air Fleet advanced in a configuration refined through years of naval aviation operations. Its formation placed the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu near the center of the task group, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers tasked with anti-aircraft and anti-submarine protection. The supporting vessels maintained positions designed to intercept torpedoes, deter submarine attacks, and provide immediate response to surface threats. This escort screen formed a layered defense that relied on early detection and coordinated maneuvering. The carriers themselves operated in a tight cluster that facilitated the rapid launch and recovery of aircraft. This arrangement optimized offensive capability consistent with the Japanese Navy's emphasis on striking first and decisively. Across the ocean, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown moved in a formation adapted to the conditions revealed through intelligence. They maintained a dispersed but coordinated structure that allowed each carrier to operate independently while contributing to a unified strike capability. The formation reflected differences in doctrine. The U.S. Navy emphasized decentralized decision-making within tactical frameworks that granted commanders flexibility. Yorktown, still undergoing repairs while underway due to damage sustained in the Coral Sea, operated at slightly reduced speed but maintained full flight operations. The American escorts, consisting of cruisers and destroyers, supported the carriers with anti-aircraft coverage and screened for submarines that might threaten the fleet. The movement of aircraft within these fleets demonstrated additional differences. Japanese carrier aviation rested on experienced aircrews who had trained extensively in coordinated strike operations. These aviators had executed complex attacks during earlier campaigns, demonstrating skill in torpedo delivery, dive bombing, and fleet support. Their carriers maintained well-practiced procedures for launching large formations in rapid succession. However, the training system did not account for the losses sustained in the Coral Sea, and earlier operations leaving some air groups depleted. Replacement pilots lacked equivalent combat experience. Despite these gaps, Japanese aircrew cohesion remained strong, and commanders relied heavily on their capabilities. American carrier aviation included a mixture of seasoned and relatively inexperienced pilots. Training programs had accelerated following the outbreak of war, producing aviators who had fewer hours in combat formations, but demonstrated resilience and adaptability. The American Navy emphasized defensive tactics such as fighter direction from the carriers and prioritized radio communication during flight operations. Although American torpedo squadrons suffered from outdated aircraft and lower effectiveness, dive bomber units held significant potential due to their precision and range. These characteristics influenced the tactical flexibility of the American carriers as they prepared for the engagement. Submarine forces also contributed to the movement of the fleets. American submarines attempted to track the Japanese approach, but achieved only limited success due to the speed and maneuverability of the First Air Fleet. Japanese submarines assigned to the operation occupied distant patrol lines intended to intercept American ships attempting to reinforce Midway. However, the timing of their deployment reduced their effectiveness as they arrived after the American carriers had already reached their designated positions. This misalignment reflected the challenges Japan faced in coordinating multiple task groups across vast distances. Logistics shaped the motion of both fleets. The Japanese First Air Fleet operated at the edge of its practical range, requiring significant fuel consumption to maintain the speeds necessary for carrier operations. Fleet oilers supported the movement, but the risk of prolonged engagement or extended searches influenced Japanese decisions about maneuvering. In contrast, the American carriers benefited from closer proximity to Pearl Harbor and from secure supply lines. Although they carried fuel reserves designed to support extended operations, they remained aware that returning to base would be necessary after the battle, especially for Yorktown, whose damage made her more vulnerable than her counterparts. Communication practices within each fleet affected coordination. Japanese carriers relied on a hierarchical command structure in which orders flowed from a central authority. This system worked efficiently under stable conditions, but made it difficult to adapt rapidly to unexpected developments. American carriers used a more flexible approach, with commanders adjusting independently, based on situational awareness, while maintaining overall strategic alignment. This distributed decision-making framework allowed the American fleet to respond to changing circumstances more quickly, particularly when reconnaissance reports indicated Japanese movements. Weather patterns influenced the fleet's ability to detect each other. Low cloud layers and shifting atmospheric conditions created variable visibility across the operational area. For the Japanese fleet, these conditions complicated reconnaissance coverage. Gaps in visibility allowed the American carriers to maintain concealment during critical hours. For the Americans, the weather provided both an obstacle to accurate navigation for strike groups and an advantage in masking their approach. Cloud cover later enabled American dive bombers to descend unseen until the final moments before their attacks. Meanwhile, the movement of aircraft over the Central Pacific began to shape the battle's opening phase. Japanese pilots en route to Midway executed their assigned tasks, encountering scattered defensive intercepts. Their reports indicated that the island's defenses required further neutralization, prompting discussions aboard Akagi about the need for a second strike. This assessment placed pressure on the carriers to rearm aircraft with bombs suited for land targets. These preparations began while reconnaissance aircraft continued their patrols, creating a situation in which the Japanese deck crews were engaged in complex rearming operations when the first reports of American aircraft sightings arrived. American strike groups launched in multiple phases. Torpedo squadrons departed earlier than intended due to navigational misunderstandings and varying interpretations of flight paths. These squadrons flew at low altitude, exposing themselves to fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. Although many of these aircraft would be lost before reaching their targets, their presence drew Japanese fighters downward and disrupted the defensive combat air patrol pattern. This shift in fighter disposition influenced the later window in which American dive bombers approached from higher altitudes. The movement of the fleets during these hours produced an environment defined by limited visibility, incomplete reconnaissance, and the pressure of timing. Each carrier group maneuvered based on expectations shaped by intelligence, previous engagements, and internal doctrine. As the morning progressed, the convergence of these forces reached a critical threshold. Japanese carriers continued operations with confidence in their initial strategic assumptions. American carriers advanced according to intelligence that revealed an opportunity to strike during a period of vulnerability. The opposing fleets navigated the Pacific as interconnected elements of a single developing engagement. The motion of these fleets, shaped by doctrine, logistics, reconnaissance, and command philosophy, set the stage for the decisive minutes that followed. The patterns established during their approach, fighter positioning, deck operations, reconnaissance gaps, and fleet maneuvering, formed the conditions under which the balance of naval power would shift. The fleets had moved into position through a sequence of decisions that reflected both strategic intent and operational constraint. As their aircraft converged above the Japanese carriers, the effects of these movements would become evident in the outcome of the battle. The critical turning point of 4th of June 1942 emerged during a narrow interval in which the Japanese carrier force occupied its most vulnerable posture. This moment, lasting only a few minutes, resulted from the convergence of timing, operational strain, and the arrival of American dive bomber squadrons at altitudes above the range of Japanese defensive awareness. Although the events unfolded quickly, their roots lay in the cumulative decisions made throughout the morning. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu operated under intense pressure as their commanders attempted to reconcile the need to launch a second strike against Midway with the requirement to prepare for a broader fleet engagement. As aircraft returned from the initial attack, the carriers entered a period in which their decks became congested, their hangars filled with fuel lines and ordnance, and their fighters committed to intercepting earlier American attacks. Within this fragile state, the arrival of American dive bombers initiated a transformation that altered the course of the Pacific War. Shortly before the decisive attack, Japanese officers had reached a turning point in their assessment of Midway's condition. Reports from the returning strike group indicated that the island's defenses remained functional. The airfields required neutralization before the amphibious assault could proceed. This assessment prompted Vice Admiral Chuichi Negumo to prepare for a second strike against Midway. Aircraft below deck were armed with bombs suitable for land targets. Fuel crews threaded hoses across hangar spaces to replenish returning aircraft. Ordnance teams moved torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs between magazines and work areas, as officers attempted to arrange their forces for both land bombardment and fleet engagement. These conditions created an environment in which the carriers could not rapidly respond to new threats. The earlier American torpedo attacks had exerted additional pressure on the defensive system. Torpedo squadrons from Hornet Enterprise and Yorktown approached the Japanese fleet at low altitude. Their aircraft, slower and less maneuverable than Japanese fighters, faced overwhelming resistance. Many were intercepted before reaching torpedo release range. Others pressed forward despite heavy losses. Although none of these early attacks inflicted damage, they forced Japanese fighters to descend to lower altitudes. As a result, the combat air patrol pattern became disorganized, with fighters scattered across the area and struggling to regain altitude. This disruption would have major consequences when American dive bombers arrived moments later. Simultaneously, dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown navigated toward the Japanese fleet after a period of uncertainty. Their approach involved long flights over open water, with crews relying on visual cues and estimated navigation to locate their targets. Cloud cover shielded their movements at critical points, delaying detection. When they emerged into clear air above the Japanese fleet, the carriers lay directly beneath them, engaged in the complex processes of recovering aircraft, refueling, and rearming. The timing proved precise. The Japanese air defenses remained oriented toward low-altitude threats, leaving the upper approach path unprotected. The first dive bombers descending upon Kaga initiated the sequence that defined the 5-minute interval. Pilots observed the carrier's deck crowded with aircraft fuel lines and ordnance. Japanese deck crews attempted to respond with anti-aircraft fire as the dive bombers entered steep attacks. Bombs released from high altitude descended with accuracy due to the clear visibility and minimal interference. When they struck the flight deck, they ignited fuel vapors and detonated ordnance stored below. Fires spread rapidly through the forward hangar, fueled by open fuel lines connected to aircraft that had not yet completed refueling. Damage control crews attempted to contain the flames, but the scale of the explosions quickly overwhelmed their efforts. Moments later, another group of dive bombers from Enterprise attacked Akagi. Although fewer aircraft targeted the flagship, their bombs struck critical areas. One bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated near the upper hangar, where aircraft and fuel operated in close proximity. Another bomb exploded near the aft section, igniting further fires. The resulting damage impaired the carrier's ability to conduct flight operations and threatened its command functions. Flames spread through compartments, trapping crew members and forcing officers to consider abandonment procedures. The sudden incapacitation of Akagi removed the operational center of the First Air Fleet at a moment when coordinated action remained essential. At nearly the same time, Yorktown's dive bombers located Soryu, conducting a similar attack. The carrier's deck, like those of the others, contained aircraft undergoing preparation for future sorties. The bombs that struck Soryu penetrated the flight deck and ignited fires within the hangar. The carrier suffered rapid internal explosions that mirrored those aboard Kaga. Fire suppression systems proved inadequate for the scale of damage. Within minutes, Soryu lost the capacity to launch or recover aircraft, and the fires spread uncontrollably. The speed of destruction stunned Japanese officers. Communications officers attempted to relay damage reports, but messages grew fragmented as fires disrupted electrical systems. Attempts to coordinate fighter cover became impractical once the carriers lost the ability to conduct flight operations. Escort vessels approached to assist with firefighting, yet the scale of internal damage made these efforts insufficient. Each carrier experienced a chain of explosions fueled by fuel vapors, unspent ordnance, and the presence of aircraft arranged closely together. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized offensive capability, but the resulting design left carriers susceptible to rapid internal fires when attacked during rearming procedures. Within the American strike groups, the realization that the attack had succeeded emerged gradually. Pilots observed fires erupting across the carrier's decks as they ascended from their dives. Smoke columns rose into the sky, marking the carrier's condition. Radio reports confirmed hits across multiple vessels. Many pilots had expected significant resistance, but found the sky comparatively clear due to the earlier disruption of Japanese fighter patrols. The effect of the attack surpassed initial expectations. After regrouping, American squadrons began their return flights, aware that their actions had altered the situation, but unaware of the full extent of the destruction below. For the Japanese fleet, the 5-minute interval created immediate operational consequences. The loss of 3 of the 4 carriers eliminated the majority of the First Air Fleet's striking power. Air crews aboard Soryu, the remaining operational carrier, faced the responsibility of mounting a counterattack, despite the overwhelming disadvantage. Officers on escort ships debated rescue priorities as they encountered fires, debris, and injured personnel. The ability to coordinate a coherent response diminished rapidly. The transformation extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The loss of experienced pilots, mechanics, and flight deck personnel represented a deeper strategic setback. Japan's naval aviation program had produced elite crews whose training required significant time and resources. Many of these individuals perished during the fires or were lost when the carriers eventually sank. Their absence would influence the effectiveness of Japanese carrier operations throughout the remainder of the war. American commanders recognized the significance of the moment through sequential reports, yet they continued to prepare for further engagements. They understood that Soryu remained operational and could launch counterstrikes. This awareness prompted continued vigilance, yet the destruction of the 3 carriers allowed the American fleet to shift from a reactive posture to one prepared for sustained operations. The 5-minute transformation marked more than the destruction of vessels. It represented a shift in the balance of naval power. Japan had entered the engagement with confidence rooted in doctrine and experience. Within minutes, the foundations of that confidence collapsed. the sudden reversal emerged from the confluence of reconnaissance timing, fighter disposition, deck operations, and the vulnerability inherent in carrier warfare. The speed of these events provides insight into the nature of the battle. While the larger operation spanned hours and involved complex coordination, the decisive moment unfolded within an interval so brief that many aboard the Japanese carriers experienced the transition from full operational readiness to catastrophic damage without fully perceiving the sequence of events that caused it. This brief period demonstrated the decisive potential of aerial warfare and the fragile structure supporting carrier operations during critical transitions between sorties. In later assessments, historians recognize this interval as the moment at which Japan's chance to achieve its broader wartime objectives diminished irreversibly. The rapid collapse of three carriers underscored the consequences of operational overextension and the reliance on timing that could not withstand unexpected developments. The fleets continued to maneuver in the hours that followed, yet the outcome had already been shaped by the events of these minutes. The minutes following the destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu produced an environment defined by confusion, fragmented communication, and competing demands on commanders who could no longer rely on the structures that had supported their operations earlier in the morning. What had begun as a well-organized offensive quickly evolved into a situation marked by uncertainty. The remaining operational units of the Japanese fleet confronted contrasting assessments of the battle's progress, incomplete reports from scattered aircraft, and a rapidly shifting tactical picture. At the same time, American forces faced their own complexities as they attempted to interpret Japanese movements, prepare for potential counterstrikes, and maintain the operational cohesion needed for sustained conflict. The expanding complexity of the battle reflected both the immediate effects of the carrier losses and the nonlinear nature of carrier warfare, where moments of clarity often gave way to longer periods of ambiguity. Aboard Hiryu, the last intact Japanese carrier officers attempted to convert incomplete and often contradictory information into practical decisions. Early reports indicated that several carriers had been hit, but the scale of damage remained unclear. Communications with Akagi, the flagship, grew intermittent. Only fragmentary messages revealed the extent of the disaster. The loss of centralized command forced Hiryu's officers to improvise. They evaluated whether to launch counterstrikes, withdraw, or attempt to regroup surviving aircraft scattered across the area. The carrier's air groups retained enough strength to mount offensive operations, yet each decision required assumptions about American movements that could not be verified. Simultaneously, debris and smoke across the horizon created visual disruptions that made accurate observation difficult. Escort vessels maneuvering to assist damaged carriers faced hazards posed by exploding ordnance, unstable fuel lines, and the risk of further aerial attack. Many ships reported problems with radio reception due to interference generated by fires and damaged electrical systems aboard the crippled vessels. These technical limitations compounded the confusion, making it difficult for officers to determine the best course of action for rescue efforts, defensive posture, and coordination with Hiryu. For American forces, the rapid success of their dive bomber attack presented its own challenges. Pilots returning to Enterprise Yorktown and Hornet provided reports describing multiple carriers burning, yet they lacked precision regarding which vessels remained operational. This uncertainty required American commanders to assume that at least one Japanese carrier still possessed the ability to mount counterstrikes. The need for caution shaped their decisions as the battle continued. They understood that even a single Japanese carrier properly positioned could launch attacks capable of inflicting significant damage. Further complicating the situation, American strike groups had approached the Japanese fleet from varying angles due to differences in navigation and coordination. Some squadrons returned with depleted fuel reserves, necessitating emergency landings or water ditching. Others returned in formations that diverged from their initial launch order, complicating recovery operations. Flight decks became congested as carriers received aircraft damaged by combat or weather conditions. These stresses demanded rapid decision-making from deck officers responsible for managing landings, refueling, and rearming. The complexity deepened when Hiryu launched its counterattack. Japanese commanders interpreted the destruction of the three carriers as severe but not yet decisive. They believed that eliminating one or more American carriers could restore the possibility of achieving operational success. The first counterstrike originated from Hiryu's dive bomber group, which located Yorktown after navigating through scattered cloud cover. The attack inflicted damage that temporarily disabled the carrier, though American damage control crews responded quickly and restored operational capacity. This sequence created additional complexity for American commanders, who now faced evidence that Japanese aviation remained active. The second wave from Hiryu, composed of torpedo aircraft, further complicated the situation by striking Yorktown again, leading to severe internal damage and the eventual evacuation of the ship. These attacks revealed that the Japanese fleet, despite suffering catastrophic losses, retained enough capability to inflict meaningful harm. American commanders needed to adapt their strategy based on the recognition that the battle's outcome was not yet fully secured. They prepared additional strike groups while managing the damage to Yorktown, coordinating escort coverage, and positioning Enterprise and Hornet for subsequent operations. Meanwhile, Japanese officers aboard Hiryu found themselves confronting the same constraints that had afflicted the other carriers earlier in the day. Aircraft returning from the counterattacks required refueling and rearming. Deck crews worked rapidly, aware that American aircraft could appear at any moment. Reconnaissance became increasingly difficult due to the expanding cloud cover, smoke from burning carriers, and scattered debris. Japanese officers attempted to use surviving reconnaissance aircraft to locate additional American carriers, yet the limited number of available aircraft reduced their ability to form a comprehensive picture of the battle. The complexity extended beyond immediate tactical decisions. The larger Japanese task groups operating in support roles faced challenges coordinating with the embattled carrier force. Battleships and cruisers positioned to the west and north remained unaware of the scale of destruction. Their officers attempted to interpret partial transmissions, but lacked the information needed to plan coordinated maneuvers. Submarine units operating along predetermined lines received orders to adjust their patrols, yet the delays inherent in long-range communication limited their ability to influence the unfolding battle. American decision-making also grew more complex as additional reports arrived. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the presence of a remaining Japanese carrier, yet cloud cover and the movement of the fleet made locating Hiryu difficult. Once identified, American commanders faced the challenge of coordinating strike groups amid the fatigue accumulated across several hours of sustained operations. Aircraft required refueling and rearming, yet flight decks remained congested from earlier recoveries. Damage to Yorktown further strained the available resources. Nevertheless, the American fleet prepared for a coordinated strike intended to neutralize the final Japanese carrier. The attack on Hiryu, conducted in the afternoon, reflected the cumulative decisions made across the day. Dive bomber groups approached from varying directions, navigating through cloud banks and over open water. When they located Hiryu, they found the carrier engaged in preparations for another sortie. The attack inflicted fatal damage, igniting fires similar to those that had overwhelmed the other carriers. With Hiryu disabled, the Japanese fleet lost its final operational flight deck, marking the end of its ability to conduct coordinated air operations. Yet the complexity of the battle did not end with Hiryu's destruction. Japanese surface commanders confronted the difficult task of reorganizing their forces. Debates arose regarding whether to withdraw attempt rescue operations or prepare for night engagements. The Japanese Navy possessed significant capacity for night combat, yet the loss of air cover made any such engagement hazardous. Escort vessels prioritized rescuing crews from the burning carriers, though fires, explosions, and drifting debris limited their progress. The separation of task groups made coordinated withdrawal challenging. American forces, though, holding the advantage, remained cautious. The possibility of submarine threats persisted. Fuel consumption among aircraft and ships required careful management. Nightfall loomed, raising concerns about navigation, recovery of lost crews, and the maintenance of fleet cohesion. Commanders adjusted their formations to reduce vulnerability while continuing to monitor surviving Japanese vessels that might attempt escape or counterattack. The expanding complexity of the Midway battle reveals the layered nature of naval aviation warfare. The fight did not consist of a single decisive moment followed by clarity, but unfolded through sequences of shifting conditions, incomplete information, and rapidly changing priorities. Each decision, whether made aboard a damaged Japanese carrier or within an American command room reflected the broader uncertainties that defined the engagement. These complexities shaped the hours following the decisive attack and influenced the strategic decisions that followed. Ultimately, the intricate conditions that emerged during the battle highlight the fragile structure of carrier warfare. The operational environment demanded rapid coordination of flight operations, defensive postures, reconnaissance efforts, and fleet maneuvering. When any part of this structure collapsed, complexity expanded across all others. The events of 4th of June demonstrated how quickly a coherent battle plan could dissolve under pressure, and how both sides navigated a landscape marked by uncertainty, fragmented communication, and shifting threats. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers within minutes on the morning of 4th of June 1942 produced a range of interpretations that have persisted across decades of historical analysis. Scholars, naval officers, and military historians have examined the events from differing perspectives, each emphasizing distinct elements of intelligence doctrine, timing, and human decision-making. Although the outcome appears decisive in retrospect, its causes remain the subject of debate. The interpretations derive from surviving operational records, post-war testimonies, and contrasting schools of thought that seek to explain how a well-trained and experienced fleet succumbed so rapidly to a coordinated attack. The variety of viewpoints reflects the complexity of carrier warfare and the challenge of reconstructing decisions made under conditions of uncertainty. One dominant interpretation emphasizes the effect of American intelligence. The code-breaking effort that identified Midway as the attack's target allowed the United States to position its carriers in advance. This school argues that the strategic success achieved by American forces resulted from information superiority rather than a spontaneous convergence of circumstances. By knowing the Japanese timetable bearing and operational intent, American commanders launched their aircraft at the time most likely to exploit Japanese vulnerability. Advocates of this interpretation point to the structure of naval warfare, where foreknowledge of an opponent's movements provides a decisive advantage. They argue that the ability to place carriers northeast of Midway, unseen by Japanese reconnaissance, represented the foundation upon which the subsequent events rested. A second interpretation focuses on Japanese overconfidence. Supporters of this perspective contend that the Japanese command entered the Midway operation with assumptions shaped by earlier victories. These assumptions included the belief that American carrier forces were weakened, that Yorktown remained out of service, and that Japan's own pilots and deck crews retained a qualitative advantage. This school argues that doctrinal rigidity prevented Japanese commanders from responding effectively when new information appeared. The decision to rearm aircraft, repeatedly combined with the commitment to a second strike on Midway, created vulnerabilities that could have been mitigated had commanders adopted a more flexible posture. This interpretation highlights the influence of earlier experiences on the decisions made aboard Akagi and the broader First Air Fleet. A third interpretation emphasizes the structural limitations within Japanese carrier design and deck operations. Advocates of this view point to the carrier's fragility during transitional periods between sorties. Japanese carriers maintained large numbers of aircraft within enclosed hangars where fuel lines, bombs, and torpedoes were stored in close proximity. This arrangement maximized offensive capability, enabling rapid sortie rates, but it also increased vulnerability when the carriers were caught during rearming procedures. Proponents note that Japanese damage control systems prioritized speed and efficiency during flight operations, but proved insufficient when rapid fires ignited in multiple compartments. This view underscores the idea that the carrier losses resulted not solely from tactical errors, but also from inherent design characteristics that exacerbated the impact of American dive bomber attacks. Another school of interpretation highlights the role of American torpedo squadrons. Although these early attacks inflicted no direct damage, they disrupted Japanese defensive patterns. Japanese fighters descended to engage the low-flying torpedo bombers, thereby leaving the upper approaches undefended. Scholars who adopt this view argue that the sacrifice of these squadrons, unintended yet consequential, created the conditions necessary for the success of the dive bombers. They contend that this disruption offers insight into the structure of carrier defense, where concentrated attacks from multiple altitudes and directions can overwhelm even experienced air patrols. The significance of timing becomes central to this interpretation, Without the diversion created by earlier American attacks, Japanese fighters would likely have intercepted the dive bombers before they reached their attack positions. A separate perspective examines the role of chance. Proponents of this interpretation caution against attributing the outcome to any single factor. They point to the inherent unpredictability of long-range naval aviation. American dive bomber squadrons approached the Japanese fleet based on incomplete reconnaissance, with some units deviating from intended flight paths. Yet, despite these uncertainties, key squadrons arrived over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment when they were most vulnerable. Weather patterns, cloud formations, and navigational decisions all contributed to the timing. Advocates of this viewpoint highlight that if any of these variables had shifted slightly, if cloud cover had been thicker, if the Japanese scout plane had launched on time, or if American aircraft had arrived minutes earlier or later, then the outcome might have differed significantly. A further interpretation centers on Japanese command structure. Analysts within this school argue that the hierarchical command model aboard Japanese carriers limited the fleet's ability to adapt to dynamic conditions. Vice Admiral Nagumo's decision-making process relied on established doctrine emphasizing concentrated strikes. When presented with conflicting reports, some suggesting the need for a second strike on Midway, others indicating possible American presence, Nagumo followed procedures that prioritized coordinated operations rather than immediate adjustments. Supporters of this interpretation argue that a more decentralized command structure might have allowed Japanese carriers to adopt a defensive posture more rapidly. They note that the delay in launching an anti-ship strike emerged partly from adherence to pre-established sequences rather than tactical necessity. Another perspective assesses the battle through the lens of operational exhaustion. The Japanese fleet had engaged in continuous operations across vast distances in the preceding months. The loss of experienced crews at the Coral Sea reduced the overall capability of air groups participating at Midway. Analysts who emphasize this factor argue that cumulative fatigue influenced reaction times, reconnaissance quality, and the fleet's overall situational awareness. This interpretation does not diminish the strategic importance of intelligence or timing, but adds a human element to the decision-making process. It suggests that the battle occurred at a moment when Japanese aviation had reached a point of diminishing returns due to sustained operational pressure. Historians adopting a revisionist perspective argue that the interpretation of Midway as a decisive turning point can obscure the broader strategic context. They contend that while the loss of the carriers represented a major setback, Japan already faced significant long-term disadvantages in industrial capacity logistics and strategic flexibility. From this viewpoint, Midway accelerated a decline that had already begun rather than creating it. These scholars highlight that Japanese expansion had overextended supply lines, that industrial production could not match American output, and that strategic resources were strained across multiple theaters. In this context, Midway's significance lies less in its direct consequences and more in its confirmation of structural disparities. In contrast, traditional interpretations view Midway as the pivotal moment of the Pacific War. Proponents assert that the destruction of the First Air Fleet's core undermined Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations for the remainder of the conflict. They argue that the loss of experienced air crews created a gap that Japan could not fill, making later operations less effective even when conducted with an intact carrier. This school emphasizes that Japan's strategic momentum ended at Midway and that the subsequent campaigns in the Solomons confirmed the shift toward American dominance. A final interpretation concerns the symbolic aspect of the battle. Scholars who emphasize this perspective argue that Midway represented a psychological inflection point. For Japan, the defeat marked the end of the belief that its carrier fleet could dictate the course of the war. For the United States, it signaled that victory was achievable despite earlier setbacks. These interpretations rely more on social and political analysis than on operational detail, yet they illustrate the broader context within which military events influence national resolve. Collectively, these interpretations reveal the complexity of analyzing a moment shaped by interlocking factors: intelligence, timing, doctrine, equipment, human judgment, and chance. Rather than presenting a single explanation, the historical discourse surrounding Midway demonstrates how multiple causes can intersect to produce a decisive outcome. The diversity of viewpoints underscores that the 5-minute transformation cannot be understood through one lens alone. Each interpretation contributes insight into the broader dynamics of naval warfare and the unpredictable nature of conflict at sea. The effort to reconstruct the events of 4th of June 1942 has relied on a broad spectrum of historical tools and analytical methods that extend far beyond traditional narrative accounts. The complexities of carrier warfare, the fragmentary nature of wartime documentation, and the loss of ships and records beneath the Pacific have required historians to integrate a diverse range of sources. Modern analysis draws from archival documents, survivor testimony, technological assessments, and the physical examination of wrecks resting at extreme depths. These tools provide a structured foundation for interpreting a battle defined by rapid movement, incomplete communication, and moments of decisive action. Archival research remains the core method for understanding the tempo and sequence of events. Surviving operational orders, logbooks, and after-action reports from the U.S. Navy provide detailed insight into flight operations, fuel consumption, aircraft losses, and command decisions. These records preserved in naval archives reveal the planning processes of American carriers and the challenges faced by crew members as they coordinated complex strike operations. Although Japanese archival material is more limited due to wartime destruction, surviving documents such as communications from the 1st Air Fleet and staff memoranda from the Combined Fleet offer valuable information on decision-making aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These documents allow scholars to trace the development of Japanese operational doctrine and the assumptions that shaped the Midway Plan. Code-breaking records add further depth to the analysis. The decryption work conducted at Station Hypo left behind detailed reports documenting how analysts pieced together Japanese operational intent. These records demonstrate the role of intercepted communications in shaping American strategy. By studying the methods used to reconstruct Japanese message traffic, historians can evaluate the extent to which intelligence contributed to American decisions. The technical details preserved in these files, frequency logs, cipher tables, and decoded memoranda illustrate the systematic process that allowed the United States to anticipate the Japanese attack. Another tool of analysis involves the use of oral history. Interviews conducted with surviving pilots, deck crew members, and officers from both navies provide first-hand accounts of the battle's tempo conditions and atmosphere. These testimonies describe the physical environment within the carriers, the challenges of navigating long-range flights over open water, and the confusion that unfolded during critical moments. Although oral histories rely on memory, which may fade or shift over time, they offer valuable perspectives on operational pressures and human decision-making. Combined with archival records, these accounts help historians determine where recollection aligns with documented evidence and where discrepancies require further evaluation. Researchers also use aviation and naval engineering analysis to understand the vulnerabilities of the carriers involved. Technical studies examine the design of Japanese flight decks, hangar arrangements, fuel distribution systems, and ordnance storage procedures. These assessments illustrate how the structural layout of the carriers influenced the spread of fire and the speed of internal damage. Comparative studies of American and Japanese damage control practices further illuminate why the Japanese carriers suffered such rapid destruction during the dive bomber attacks. The emphasis on technical evaluation provides insight into the interaction between design choices and operational outcomes. In addition to engineering analysis, flight path reconstruction serves as a critical tool. Modern historians use mission reports, navigational logs, and surviving flight diagrams to reconstruct the routes flown by dive bombers and torpedo aircraft. These reconstructions integrate data on wind speed, cloud cover, aircraft range, and formation patterns. The resulting models demonstrate how American aircraft approached the Japanese fleet, why certain squadrons diverged from planned courses, and how the convergence of multiple air groups occurred within such a narrow time window. This approach allows for a clearer understanding of how navigation challenges shape the timing of the attacks. Advanced historical analysis incorporates digital mapping and satellite-based modeling. By integrating historical coordinates with modern geospatial tools, researchers can recreate the positions of ships during the battle with greater precision. These reconstructions illustrate the distances between task groups, the arcs of reconnaissance patrols, and the movement of aircraft in relation to the carriers. Such models help historians determine how visibility conditions affected operational awareness and how the Japanese fleet's formation influenced its vulnerability. Although the original ships are no longer at the surface, their movements can be analyzed through a combination of historical data and contemporary mapping techniques. Underwater exploration represents another methodological advancement. The discovery of the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at great depths has provided physical evidence that complements archival sources. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with cameras and sonar have documented the state of the hulls, the pattern of structural collapse, and the distribution of debris fields. These findings offer insight into how the carriers sank and the extent of the damage caused by fires and explosions. The preservation of many structural elements due to the absence of light and low oxygen levels at depth allows researchers to examine the arrangement of the ship's final condition with clarity unavailable from wartime accounts. Naval archaeology extends beyond the carriers themselves. The examination of debris fields, scattered equipment, and associated artifacts contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of the battle's material aspects. These items reveal the types of aircraft present aboard the ships at the time of the attack, the degree of structural damage, and the conditions that prevailed during the final moments of the carrier's existence. Archaeological findings corroborate written accounts while also highlighting areas where the historical record remains incomplete. A further tool used in analyzing the battle involves the examination of combat photography and aerial imagery. Although limited surviving photographs taken during the attack show smoke patterns, ship positions, and the sequence of bomb impacts. These images, when combined with timing logs, help establish a clearer chronology of events. Researchers can correlate visual evidence with pilot reports and ship logs, reinforcing the accuracy of the reconstructed timeline. Historians also employ comparative analysis to evaluate broader trends. By studying earlier and later carrier engagements such as the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz battles, researchers examine how doctrines evolved and how lessons from Midway influenced subsequent operations. This comparative approach helps determine which elements of the Midway battle were unique and which reflected structural characteristics of carrier warfare. The use of comparative methodology situates Midway within a larger analytical framework, clarifying how the battle fit into the progression of naval aviation tactics. Lastly, the interdisciplinary approach, combining military history, engineering intelligence studies, and archaeology, provides a robust understanding of the battle. Each discipline contributes a piece of the broader picture. Intelligence studies explain the strategic foundation. Engineering analysis clarifies vulnerabilities. Oral histories illuminate human experience. Underwater archaeology supplies physical evidence. Together, these tools allow modern researchers to reconstruct a battle fought across thousands of miles of ocean, involving multiple moving forces and shaped by decisions made under severe time pressure. The application of these methods demonstrates that understanding Midway requires more than recounting a sequence of events. It demands the integration of diverse forms of evidence, each revealing different facets of a complex engagement. Through this combination of tools, historians have developed a detailed and multi-dimensional understanding of a moment that reshaped the Pacific War. The historical record of the Battle of Midway rests on an extensive yet incomplete foundation of documents, testimonies, and artifacts. While many elements of the engagement are well understood, significant gaps remain due to the rapid destruction of ships, the loss of equipment, and the fragmentation of communication logs. The challenge of separating confirmed facts from unresolved details reflects the nature of naval warfare, in which decisions unfold across wide distances and under conditions that distort observation. Understanding what can be proven and what remains uncertain allows historians to frame the event with clarity shaped by evidence rather than speculation. One area of relative certainty involves the overall sequence of major events. The timing of the initial Japanese strike on Midway, the approximate launch times of American strike, groups the arrival of torpedo squadrons, and the dive bomber attacks that struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are well documented. These moments appear consistently across American after-action reports, Japanese testimonies, and reconstructed timelines based on surviving records. Flight logs from Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown provide precise timing information that aligns with pilot accounts. Similarly, Japanese operational logs, though incomplete, corroborate the approximate time at which the carriers were hit and the sequence in which destruction occurred. The role of intelligence in shaping the American response is also well established. Records from Station Hypo include detailed notes and reports explaining how analysts determined that Midway, designated as AF, represented the target of the Japanese operation. These documents clearly describe the process through which American commanders received the information. Survivor testimonies and official Navy communications confirm that American fleet movements on the eve of the battle were based on intelligence assessments rather than chance. Thus, the link between code-breaking and American positioning stands on solid evidentiary ground. Certain technical details are similarly well supported. Analyses of the wrecks of the Japanese carriers confirm the scale of internal damage caused by fires and explosions. The observed structural collapse aligns with descriptions provided by surviving Japanese crew members. The distribution of debris, the nature of hull fractures, and the presence of melted metal within hangar spaces all support documented accounts of how bombs penetrated the carrier's decks and ignited stored fuel and ordnance. These physical findings complement written sources, reinforcing confidence in the understanding of how the carriers were lost. However, despite these areas of clarity, the battle contains unresolved gaps that resist definitive explanation. One notable uncertainty concerns the exact sequence of internal explosions aboard the Japanese carriers. While survivor testimonies describe rapid fire, spread the precise chain reaction that transformed initial bomb impacts into catastrophic losses. Remains difficult to reconstruct fully. The depth at which the carriers rest limits detailed examination of interior compartments. As a result, historians cannot state with certainty which specific fuel lines, bombs, or torpedoes ignited first, or how the fires traveled between compartments. Another area of uncertainty involves the gap in Japanese reconnaissance. Historians know that one scout plane, launched late due to mechanical issues, and its delayed departure contributed to Japan's failure to detect the American carriers in time. Yet the degree to which this delay affected the broader reconnaissance picture remains unclear. The incomplete flight log of the aircraft leaves uncertainty regarding how close it came to detecting the American task force. This ambiguity complicates efforts to determine how much earlier Japanese commanders might have acted had they possessed more timely information. Pilot navigation during the American approach also contains unresolved elements. While the general flight paths of the dive bombers are known, minor variations in course and altitude remain uncertain due to the limited documentation. Several pilots did not survive, leaving gaps in the record. Navigational errors or decisions made in flight contributed to the separation of squadrons, but historians cannot fully reconstruct why certain groups deviated from their intended routes. These uncertainties stem from the absence of complete flight logs and the limitations of radio communication during the mission. The decision-making process aboard Akagi during the minutes leading to the attack also contains gaps. Japanese officers later described conflicting assessments regarding whether to launch a second strike on Midway or prepare for naval engagement. However, the loss of the ship and the death of several senior officers eliminated the possibility of a complete record. The surviving documents provide insight into the overall operational doctrine, but leave unclear the precise timing of commands issued in the final minutes before the dive bomber attack. This absence complicates efforts to determine whether different decisions might have altered the carrier's defensive posture. Another area where the historical record remains incomplete concerns the American torpedo squadron attacks. While it is known that Japanese fighters descended to low altitude to intercept the torpedo planes, the exact sequence in which individual Japanese pilots engaged the attackers remains difficult to determine. Japanese combat air patrol logs exist in fragmentary form, limiting analysis of how the defense pattern deteriorated. Similarly, American accounts describe the attacks from the perspective of the aviators, but many of the pilots did not survive, leaving incomplete records of their decisions during the approach. There also remain uncertainties related to Yorktown's final hours as an operational carrier. Japanese attackers believed that they had sunk the carrier after their second strike. American damage control crews temporarily restored flight operations, but the precise timeline of these repairs contains minor inconsistencies among different reports. While the general sequence is clear, damage repair, renewed operation, and eventual abandonment, small variations in the timing suggest incomplete documentation generated under combat pressure. Historians also continue to debate specific factors that shape the timing of the decisive American attack. Some argue that atmospheric conditions provided an unintentional shield that prevented Japanese fighters from detecting the dive bombers. Others believe that the American squadrons benefited from coincidental alignment of navigation decisions. Since weather reports from the western and northern edges of the battle area remain limited, it is difficult to determine the exact visibility conditions encountered at each altitude. Finally, uncertainty persists regarding the effect of Japanese strategic doctrine on the battle's outcome. The available documents describe broad planning principles, but provide limited insight into how commanders interpreted these doctrines during moments of crisis. The combination of incomplete documentation, destroyed records, and the loss of key decision-makers leaves some questions unresolved, particularly concerning the internal debates that occurred aboard the carriers in the minutes preceding the attack. The distinction between established fact and unresolved detail forms an essential part of Midway scholarship. Historians recognize that the major contours of the battle are securely documented: the timing of attacks, the destruction of the carriers, and the strategic consequences. Yet the finer points, those that would explain exactly how each decision unfolded, how each fire ignited, or how each pilot interpreted orders, remain partially obscured. These gaps do not undermine the central narrative, but instead illustrate the inherent limitations of reconstructing events shaped by rapid movement, fragmented communication, and the loss of material evidence. The combination of what is known and what remains uncertain reflects the broader challenge of analyzing naval aviation battles. It underscores the need for caution when drawing definitive conclusions and highlights the importance of relying on multiple forms of evidence. The balance between certainty and ambiguity shapes the historical understanding of Midway and reinforces the idea that even decisive battles can contain elements that resist complete reconstruction. The human dimension of the Battle of Midway emerges from the experiences of pilots, deck crew members, mechanics, signal operators, and officers who operated within environments defined by heat noise and continuous uncertainty. Their perspectives, recorded in post-war testimonies, letters, and interviews, provide insight into the lived realities that underpinned the strategic and operational decisions shaping June 1942. These accounts depict the physical and mental strain endured by individuals reacting to events unfolding at a pace far faster than their ability to process them. While the broader narrative of Midway centers on fleet's aircraft and command decisions, the battle's texture is revealed through the actions of those who worked in the confined spaces of the carriers or in the open air thousands of feet above the Pacific. Japanese pilots who launched in the early morning carried with them the familiarity of routine procedures shaped by months of operations. Their aircraft, carefully maintained by deck crews during the night, ascended into the morning sky toward Midway. Many described the flight as calm and well-organized, supported by coordinated radio communication and formation discipline. Upon reaching the atoll, they encountered the expected defense's anti-aircraft fire, rising from the island and American fighters attempting interception. After releasing their ordnance, these pilots returned to their carriers with reports of damage inflicted and the need for a second strike. The atmosphere among returning aviators reflected a belief that the operation remained within expected parameters. Yet the calmness of their approach contrasted sharply with the conditions awaiting them upon their return. Below decks, Japanese mechanics and ordnance crews worked under significant pressure as they prepared aircraft for additional sorties. These teams operated in confined hangar spaces, filled with aircraft arranged in close proximity. Fuel lines stretched across work areas, and bombs lay positioned for rapid loading. The heat generated from engines and machinery created stifling conditions, intensified by the need to maintain pace with emerging orders. Many accounts describe the smell of gasoline permeating the hangar air during refueling procedures. Crew members reported hearing the distant sound of anti-aircraft fire and pilot communications as they worked without full awareness of the evolving tactical situation. As the first American torpedo squadrons approached, Japanese flight deck personnel observed aircraft arriving at low altitude, Their accounts reflect the rapid shift from routine operations to immediate defensive action. Signal operators relayed warnings to fighter controllers, who directed combat air patrols downward to intercept the attackers. Pilots engaged the torpedo planes, observing their persistent approach despite heavy losses. These initial engagements created a sense of urgency among the Japanese crews, who recognized that American forces had located the fleet earlier than anticipated. Yet the torpedo attacks produced no direct damage, leading some crew members to assume that the situation remained manageable. American torpedo squadron pilots described their experience in stark terms. Flying outdated aircraft with limited speed and maneuverability, they approached the Japanese fleet at low altitude. Many recounted the rapid escalation of fire directed toward them, tracers from Japanese fighters, anti-aircraft bursts from destroyers, and the constant vibration of their aircraft under evasive maneuvers. Despite these challenges, they continued toward the carriers, relying on discipline rather than expectation of survival. Some pilots noted the sight of Japanese fighters diving toward them in complex patterns designed to disrupt their formation. The accounts of surviving pilots emphasize the difficulty of aligning their aircraft for torpedo release while contending with persistent attacks. Their failure to score hits did not diminish the significance of their actions, though many did not realize at the time how their effort contributed to the disruption of Japanese defenses. Dive bomber crews from Enterprise Yorktown and Hornet described a different set of experiences. Flying at higher altitudes, they encountered cloud cover that concealed their movements. Navigation posed a challenge as pilots relied heavily on estimation and visual references to locate the Japanese fleet. Several crews recounted uncertainty during their approach, questioning whether they would find the carriers before exhausting their fuel. The moment they emerged from cloud layers to observe the Japanese fleet below stands out in many accounts as one of sudden clarity. Pilots described the sight of carriers engaged in deck operations, with aircraft lined across the decks, and smoke haze from earlier operations drifting across the formation. American dive bomber pilots recalled the steep descent toward the carriers. Their aircraft shook under the force of the dive, and the sound of wind pressure dominated the cockpit. Pilots aligned their aircraft with the carrier decks, released their bombs, and then pulled sharply upward through anti-aircraft fire. The sudden transition from focused aim to evasive ascent required rapid judgment. Many described the shock of witnessing explosions on the flight decks below, though the full extent of the damage remained unclear until later. These aviators returned to their carriers with fuel nearly depleted, and their aircraft in varying states of wear following the intense maneuvering. Japanese crew members aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu experienced the dive bomber attacks with little warning. Many accounts describe a brief alarm, followed by the sound of explosions as bombs penetrated the decks. Mechanics below deck felt the impact as shockwaves passed through the hangar spaces, causing fuel lines to rupture and ordnance to ignite. Fragmented reports describe scenes of fire spreading rapidly through cramped areas filled with combustible materials. Crew members attempted to fight the fires using available equipment, yet the scale of destruction exceeded their capacity to respond. The passageways filled with smoke, reducing visibility, and forcing individuals to navigate toward exits while assisting injured comrades. On the bridges of the carriers, officers encountered a sudden loss of control over the situation. The coordination of flight operations, essential to the fleet's offensive posture, became impossible as the fires spread. Japanese officers attempted to communicate with nearby escorts, yet the disruption of electrical systems made many channels unreliable. Surviving officers later described the difficulty of issuing commands amid the chaos, as crew members attempted to follow evacuation orders through smoke-filled compartments. American deck crews aboard Yorktown faced their own challenges as Japanese counterattacks reached the carrier. Crew members responsible for directing aircraft on the flight deck worked amid the noise of anti-aircraft guns and the heat generated by aircraft engines. The dive bomber attack from Soryu damaged the carrier significantly, yet damage control teams responded with speed. Sailors described the coordinated effort to contain fires, restore power, and prepare the ship for additional flight operations. Their accounts reflect the discipline embedded within American naval training, allowing the carrier to resume limited functions despite the damage. The subsequent torpedo attack from Soryu inflicted further damage on Yorktown, crippling her propulsion and causing significant flooding. Crew members described the difficulty of maintaining control as the ship listed. Despite these challenges, the evacuation process proceeded with organized precision. Officers directed sailors to lifeboats and rescue ships, in a manner consistent with established procedures, demonstrating the emphasis placed on containment and survival within American naval doctrine. The human dimension of the battle extends to the aftermath. Japanese survivors rescued by escort vessels described the shock of witnessing the destruction of their carriers, which had served as operational symbols of Japan's naval power. Many expressed disbelief at the scale of the loss and uncertainty about the future of the fleet. American aviators returning from their missions confronted fatigue-limited fuel and the emotional impact of witnessing the destruction they had inflicted. Ground crews worked through exhaustion to prepare aircraft for additional sorties, knowing that further attacks might be required. These accounts illustrate the physical demands and psychological pressures experienced by individuals on both sides. Their voices reflect the immediacy of the battle, the urgency of command decisions, the strain of rapid operations, and the challenge of responding to events beyond their control. Through these perspectives, the Battle of Midway becomes more than an examination of strategy and outcome. It becomes a record of human endurance shaped by the actions of individuals who navigated the uncertainties of war under conditions defined by speed danger and limited time. The destruction of 3 Japanese fleet carriers within minutes, followed hours later by the loss of Soryu, initiated a strategic shift that extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Although the battle unfolded in a remote expanse of the Pacific, its consequences influenced military planning, industrial priorities, diplomatic considerations, and the broader trajectory of the Second World War. The Battle of Midway altered the balance of naval power in a manner that neither side had anticipated at the beginning of June 1942. The strategic implications emerged gradually shaped by operational realities, and the long-term significance of losing experienced air crews, irreplaceable carriers, and the offensive capability of Japan's premier striking force. The most immediate consequence involved the loss of the First Air Fleet's core. The Japanese Navy had relied on these carriers to project power across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, enabling rapid advances during the war's early months. Their destruction created a void that could not be filled through existing industrial capacity. Japanese shipyards lacked the resources to produce new fleet carriers at the speed necessary to maintain strategic parity. Furthermore, the aircrew losses were even more critical. Japan's training system produced highly skilled pilots, but it required extensive time and resources. The loss of experienced aviators at Midway weakened Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war, reducing the effectiveness of subsequent carrier operations, even when new ships were launched. The shift in naval power influenced Japan's strategic posture. Prior to Midway, the Imperial Navy sought to expand its perimeter and isolate Australia through operations in the South Pacific. The loss of the carriers forced Japan to reconsider its offensive priorities. Instead of pursuing further expansion into the Central Pacific, the Japanese command shifted toward a more defensive orientation. Resources were redirected to strengthen positions in the Solomons, New Guinea, and other regions that now represented the limits of Japan's operational capability. The emphasis on defensive consolidation reflected the recognition that future engagements would require preserving remaining assets rather than extending supply lines further into contested waters. For the United States, Midway represented a turning point that validated the potential of carrier-based operations. Although American forces continued to face challenges in the months that followed, the victory demonstrated that coordinated air power could overcome numerical disadvantages when combined with intelligence planning and favorable circumstances. The destruction of Japan's carriers allowed the United States to shift from a strategy of delaying action to one of sustained offensive operations. This transition began in August 1942 with the Guadalcanal campaign, where American forces aimed to halt Japanese expansion and initiate a counteroffensive. The ability to launch such operations within 2 months of Midway reflected the confidence gained from the battle and the recognition that Japan no longer possessed overwhelming naval superiority. Industrial consequences also emerged. American shipyards accelerated carrier construction, guided by the understanding that future operations would rely heavily on mobile air power. By contrast, Japanese industry struggled to replenish losses. The disparity in production capacity widened as the war progressed. Midway, therefore, served as the moment when industrial potential began to influence operational possibilities more directly. American forces benefited from a growing supply of carriers aircraft and trained air crews, while Japanese forces faced a diminishing pool of resources and personnel. Diplomatic and political consequences followed the military outcome. Allied governments viewed the battle as evidence that Japan's expansion could be reversed. Reports of the victory circulated among the Allied nations, reinforcing the perception that the Pacific War had reached a turning point. Within the United States, public confidence increased, bolstering domestic support for the prolonged conflict that lay ahead. Midway did not end the war, but it reshaped the strategic environment in which subsequent campaigns would unfold and contributed to the momentum needed to sustain American operations across multiple theaters. The global balance of naval power shifted in more nuanced ways as well. Japan had entered the war with doctrines built around the ability to deliver decisive blows through carrier operations. Midway demonstrated that the vulnerability inherent in these operations could yield significant consequences when an adversary exploited moments of transition. This realization influenced naval planners beyond the Pacific. Observers recognized that massed carrier aviation, while powerful, required complex coordination and remained susceptible to timing, reconnaissance gaps, and operational strain. These insights informed post-war analyses and influenced the development of naval strategies adopted by several nations. The battle also altered the Japanese Navy's internal dynamic. The loss of senior officers aboard the destroyed carriers disrupted continuity within the Naval Aviation Command. Efforts to reorganize the fleet in the months following Midway revealed the extent to which the command structure depended on the experience of individuals who no longer remained available. Although the Navy attempted to adapt by accelerating training programs and restructuring flight operations, the decline in experience could not be reversed quickly. This limitation contributed to reduced effectiveness during later engagements, including battles in the Solomons and the Philippine Sea. Long-term consequences emerged through the progressive erosion of Japan's ability to conduct coordinated operations. Midway forced the Japanese Navy into a reactive posture during campaigns where proactive planning had previously shaped its approach. The need to defend extended positions strained remaining resources. As the war progressed, American forces launched operations deeper into Japanese-held territory, supported by expanding numbers of carriers, aircraft, and logistical units. The initial advantage gained at Midway thus amplified through subsequent operations, as Japan struggled to counter growing American strength. Midway's global impact extended to perceptions of naval warfare. The battle illustrated that control of the sea could shift not through the movement of battleships, but through the rapid deployment of aircraft. This realization influenced naval development in the decades that followed, shaping the rise of carrier-centric strategies. Navies around the world studied the engagement as a case, demonstrating the relationship between intelligence flight operations and fleet maneuvering. The shift in global momentum produced by Midway was not immediate in its full scope, yet the implications became increasingly evident as the war progressed. The loss of 4 fleet carriers undermined Japan's offensive potential, accelerated the transition to defensive operations, and allowed the United States to begin shaping the Pacific campaign on its own terms. Although other battles would follow, each with significant consequences, Midway remained the moment when the trajectory of the war moved decisively away from Japanese expansion and toward a long-term Allied advance. The broader consequences of the battle thus extended far beyond the waters northeast of Midway Atoll. They influenced strategy, production, diplomacy, and operational doctrine. The shift in momentum that began on the 4th of June 1942 did not conclude the war, yet it established the conditions under which the Pacific campaign would unfold. Through the loss of carriers, air crews, and the strategic initiative, Japan's capacity to sustain its earlier momentum diminished, while the United States gained the opportunity to initiate campaigns that would shape the remainder of the conflict. The Battle of Midway continues to serve as a focal point for analyzing the principles of naval warfare, intelligence coordination, operational planning, and the interplay between preparation and chance. Although the engagement was short in duration and geographically limited, the strategic lessons that emerged from it remain relevant to modern military analysis. These lessons extend beyond the immediate tactical actions of 4th of June 1942 and illuminate broader themes concerning the management of risk, the value of information, the vulnerabilities inherent in complex operations, and the influence of decision-making under pressure. Midway demonstrated that decisive outcomes can arise when structural strengths and weaknesses align with timing in unexpected ways. One of the most prominent lessons involves the decisive value of intelligence. The American code-breaking effort provided a strategic foundation that shaped the battle's outcome before the first aircraft launched. By identifying Midway as the target and predicting the approximate timetable of the Japanese operation, American commanders gained the opportunity to position their carriers in advance. The lesson emphasizes that information superiority can offset disadvantages in numerical strength, equipment, or operational momentum. It illustrates how intelligence, when effectively integrated into planning, can produce conditions that yield significant advantages. A second lesson concerns the limits of operational rigidity. Japanese doctrine emphasized coordinated mass strikes conducted according to predetermined sequences. This framework had proven effective in earlier campaigns, but it constrained flexibility at Midway. When faced with conflicting information, some suggesting the need for a second strike on Midway, others indicating the presence of American carriers, Japanese commanders struggled to adapt rapidly. The delay in altering aircraft loadouts combined with the commitment to scheduled operations left the carriers vulnerable during a critical period. The lesson underscores the importance of balancing doctrinal discipline with the capacity for rapid adjustment when new information emerges. The vulnerability inherent in carrier operations represents another key lesson. Aircraft carriers serve as mobile airfields, yet their operational effectiveness depends on maintaining a specific internal rhythm, launching aircraft, recovering pilots, refueling, rearming, and reorganizing flight decks. These transitions require exposure. At Midway, the Japanese carriers were caught in the midst of rearming and refueling, with hangars filled with aircraft fuel lines and ordnance. This condition magnified the damage inflicted by the American dive bombers. The lesson emphasizes that even well-protected carrier forces face periods of vulnerability when operational demands require complex deck operations. Effective carrier strategy must account for these temporary weaknesses and incorporate procedures to mitigate them. The battle also revealed the importance of decentralized decision-making. American commanders allowed individual carrier groups to operate with a degree of autonomy, enabling them to adapt to conditions encountered during the battle. Although communication challenges created complications, the flexibility granted to squadron leaders allowed them to pursue targets when opportunities presented themselves. Conversely, the hierarchical structure within the Japanese fleet slowed decision-making during critical moments. The lesson highlights the value of granting experienced officers the authority to act independently within established strategic frameworks. Another strategic lesson concerns the integration of air and surface forces. The American carriers succeeded not solely because of their aircraft, but because of the coordinated efforts of escorts, reconnaissance units, and ground-based aircraft from Midway. The multi-layered defense system forced the Japanese fleet to respond to threats from multiple directions and altitudes. Torpedo bombers, although unsuccessful in scoring hits, disrupted Japanese fighter coverage. Dive bombers exploited this disruption to reach their targets. This coordination reflects the importance of integrating diverse force components into a unified operational design. Logistical planning also emerges as a critical lesson. The Japanese fleet faced significant logistical challenges due to distance from home waters. Fuel limitations constrained maneuver options, and rearming aircraft required complex procedures that contributed to vulnerability. American forces benefited from shorter supply lines and the rapid repair capacity at Pearl Harbor, which allowed Yorktown to return to service shortly after Coral Sea. The lesson underscores the influence of logistics on strategic feasibility. Operational plans must account not only for the initial movement of forces, but also for the sustainability of extended engagements. The role of timing and chance offers another perspective. The American dive bomber squadrons arrived over the Japanese carriers at a moment when fighter cover was dispersed. This convergence resulted from a mixture of planning navigation and unforeseen variables such as cloud cover and reconnaissance delays. The lesson reflects the importance of preparing for unpredictability. Operational plans must incorporate flexibility to respond to unforeseen developments, recognizing that uncertainty represents an enduring characteristic of warfare. Midway also illustrates the impact of attrition on long-term strategic capacity. The loss of experienced Japanese air crews created a gap that could not be filled quickly. Even when Japan introduced new carriers, their effectiveness was limited by the reduced quality of aviation personnel. Conversely, American training programs continued to expand, reinforcing the advantage gained at Midway. The lesson highlights the importance of sustaining personnel development alongside equipment production. A carrier fleet is only as effective as the pilots and crew who operate it. The battle demonstrates the influence of communications disruption on decision-making. Japanese commanders experienced partial loss of communication channels due to fire damage and electrical failure aboard the carriers. This disruption prevented coordinated response and reduced situational awareness. American forces also faced communication challenges, yet their decentralized approach mitigated the impact. The lesson emphasizes the need for redundant communication structures and the ability to operate effectively when channels are compromised. Finally, Midway underscores the importance of aligning strategy with industrial potential. Japan's initial successes were achieved through well-planned operations and highly trained forces, but they occurred within a strategic framework limited by industrial capacity. The United States possessed the ability to replace carriers, aircraft, and air crews at a pace impossible for Japan to match. The lesson suggests that long-term success in large-scale conflict requires aligning operational strategy with national production capabilities. Collectively, these strategic lessons illustrate the multifaceted nature of naval warfare in the mid-20th century. Midway serves as a case study, demonstrating that decisive outcomes arise from a combination of intelligence, operational flexibility, logistical planning, personnel, readiness, and the capacity to absorb losses. The battle revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both navies and provided insight into the structural factors that shape wartime outcomes. These lessons continue to inform analyses of military operations, reinforcing the idea that strategy must integrate technical capability, human judgment, and the unpredictability inherent in conflict. The sun moved westward over the Central Pacific on the evening of June 1942, casting a dim light over waters still marked by smoke drifting from the remnants of the Japanese carrier force. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and the damaged Hiryu lay mortally injured, surrounded by escort vessels engaged in rescue efforts and attempts to control fires that had already exceeded human capability. The surface of the ocean reflected the subdued hues of dusk, revealing the scattered debris left by hours of intense combat. Aircraft fragments, wooden planks, and drifting life rafts formed a silent expanse extending across the area where the pivotal moments of the battle had taken place earlier that day. American carriers prepared for nightfall with caution, aware that submarines, damaged aircraft, and unpredictable weather could still influence the remainder of the operation. Flight decks returned to a state of controlled order following hours of rapid movement. Crews secured aircraft, checked fuel lines, and organized equipment while officers assessed the fleet's condition. Damage control teams aboard Yorktown still afloat, but critically compromised continued efforts to stabilize sections of the ship. Although the carrier's operational life had effectively ended, its role in the battle remained secure. It had absorbed attacks that might otherwise have struck Enterprise or Hornet, allowing the fleet to maintain cohesion through the critical stages of the engagement. In the Japanese fleet, nightfall brought the recognition that the operational plan guiding the Midway campaign had collapsed. Senior officers aboard surviving escorts reviewed scattered reports that confirmed the loss of the First Air Fleet's operational strength. The absence of flight decks capable of launching aircraft rendered further offensive action impossible. Efforts shifted toward withdrawing surviving units and rescuing personnel. Ships maneuvered through the wreckage, retrieving crew members who had abandoned the burning carriers. Many survivors described the subdued atmosphere aboard the rescue vessels, where sailors tended to injured comrades and attempted to comprehend the scale of the defeat. Throughout the night, fires aboard the carriers continued to burn, fueled by ruptured fuel lines and ignited ordnance. The structural integrity of the vessels weakened as internal explosions continued. When the decision to scuttle the damaged carriers was reached, destroyers approached cautiously and launched torpedoes to send the ships beneath the surface. The carriers sank gradually, their hulls disappearing into the deep ocean, where they would remain for decades before discovery. Their descent marked the end of the First Air Fleet's core, a moment that symbolized the shift in naval power taking place across the Pacific. At dawn on the 5th of June, the American fleet continued its search for remaining Japanese vessels, though no further carrier engagements occurred. The Japanese task groups that had supported the operation altered their course and began withdrawing westward. The battle had concluded, yet the consequences of the encounter extended beyond the immediate movements of the fleets. American commanders reviewed the results with clarity. 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed, and American losses, while significant, did not alter the fleet's overall operational capability. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet remained intact, supported by escort groups that had weathered the battle effectively. Yorktown, though mortally damaged, had fulfilled its strategic purpose during the engagement. In Tokyo, the first detailed reports of the defeat arrived gradually. The scale of the loss required careful assessment before being presented to senior government figures. The implications for Japan's long-term strategic planning became apparent as the extent of the aircrew losses and the destruction of the carriers emerged. The absence of experienced pilots represented a challenge more severe than the loss of the ships themselves. Japan's system of training could not replace these individuals quickly, and their absence would be felt in subsequent campaigns across the Pacific. Within the United States, the significance of the victory became evident as naval commanders submitted their reports. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that American forces could reverse earlier setbacks and contest Japan's expansion with growing effectiveness. The success reinforced confidence in the decision to prioritize naval aviation and carrier operations. It also affirmed the value of intelligence as a strategic instrument. The correlation between preparation and outcome illustrated the potential for information and planning to shape engagements before they unfolded. The broader narrative of the Pacific War shifted after Midway. The Japanese fleet retained the capacity to defend its territory and launch localized operations, but the momentum that had defined its early war strategy had dissipated. American forces began to transition from defense to offense, preparing for operations in the Solomon Islands and beyond. The battle's significance lay not only in the destruction of 4 carriers, but in the transformation of strategic direction. The Pacific became the stage for a sustained campaign in which American industrial strength, logistical capability, and expanding naval air power would gradually assert dominance. The remnants of the battle area returned to silence as winds dispersed the last traces of smoke. The ocean resumed its familiar rhythms, concealing the wrecks resting thousands of feet below. The sailors and aviators who had participated in the engagement continued their duties, aware that future battles awaited them. The events of 4th of June had passed, yet their consequences had already begun to reshape the trajectory of the war. The Battle of Midway occupies a unique position in the history of naval warfare. Although brief in duration, the engagement revealed the intricacies of carrier operations and the influence of intelligence, logistics, and human judgment. Its outcome emerged from a combination of preparation and circumstance, demonstrating that even well-planned operations remain vulnerable to disruption during moments of transition. The destruction of the Japanese carriers occurred within a narrow window, yet the factors that created that window extended across months of operational decisions and strategic assumptions. The significance of the battle lies not only in the loss of ships and air crews, but in the shift in strategic direction that followed. Midway halted Japan's expansion and initiated a period in which American forces gradually advanced across the Pacific. It illustrated the capacity of naval aviation to reshape fleets and influence the balance of power across vast distances. The engagement also offered enduring lessons regarding the value of intelligence, the necessity of flexible command structures, and the importance of aligning strategic objectives with industrial capability. Midway serves as a reminder that history often turns on moments when conditions align unexpectedly. The battle demonstrated how actions taken within minutes can alter the course of years. It remains an example of the relationship between preparation and opportunity, reflecting both the deliberate planning of commanders and the unpredictable nature of conflict. Although decades have passed, the study of Midway continues to reveal insights into the complexities of warfare, the demands placed upon individuals during moments of crisis, and the broader patterns that shape historical outcomes. Through the combination of strategic analysis and human experience, the story of Midway endures as one of the defining episodes of the Pacific War, offering a measured perspective on a moment when the balance of power shifted beneath the wide expanse of the Pacific Ocean.